Hey guys, welcome back to the channel, Coffee and Cartridges. Today we're going to talk about the bigger caliber advantage. I'm going to explain what that is and what it really means and how it applies to you as a hunter. Stay tuned. Alright, so before we get into the details and the weeds of this topic, let's do a quick rundown, kind of lay the foundation. Check this out. Now, if you have two bullets that weigh the same, but they're in different calibers, the smaller caliber will be longer and more sleek, and of course the bigger caliber is shorter and wider. Is there an advantage to that shorter, fatter bullet? Well, actually there is. All things being equal, the bigger caliber bullet will be much faster. Why is that? It's all about surface area. On the back of the bullet, you have much more surface area. And so the force being applied to that bullet from the pressure and combustion of the powder going off has more surface area to impact, which is a good thing and will give it more speed. And then once again, on the side of the bullet, you actually have less surface area. And so there's less surface area to be engraved by the lands of the rifling. And as it goes down the bore, there's simply less surface area where friction can be applied. So a 130 grain bullet in a 30-06 will be significantly faster than a 130 grain bullet in a 270. Hopefully that explains what I'm talking about. And now let's go a little further. First of all, let me just say this can be a hard thing to pick up or notice at times. If you have a reloading manual and you pull it up and you look for some of these examples, you can find it. In fact, I will show you one now. Here's an example, 30-06 Springfield. You can see the bullet weights there with the 280 Remington and the same bullet weights. You're going to get a max velocity of around 2,600 for the 280 Remington compared to about 2,750 for the 30-06. However, if you look at the barrel lengths, they're only 22 inches in the 280. So take another 50 feet per second off of that, and really you've got about 100 feet per second difference. So that's just an example of the bigger caliber advantage. There are times it's around 100 feet per second. I've even seen up to 200 or 300 feet per second. It can be more dramatic than this, but this is just an example. And so that's an example of what I'm talking about. You know, that's very similar caliber, .284 versus .308. Not a lot of difference. 7mm versus basically 7.5mm. But you still have the advantage. But as you flip through any reloading manual, it's not always straightforward and it's not always easy to see. One, the barrel lengths on the testing rifle could be different. Let's say a 110 grain bullet in a 30-06 versus a 110 grain bullet in a 25-06 are probably going to be completely different bullets. The 110 is probably going to be like a VMAX or a ballistic tip, some kind of varmint round in the 30-06. And in a totally different bullet in the 25-06. So different bullets, potentially different barrel lengths. And then of course there's bullet seating. Any reloading manual is going to use SAMI cartridge overall length. And so with two different diameter bullets of the same weight, one's going to be a lot longer. And therefore going by SAMI cartridge overall length potentially could go deeper into the case and take up more case capacity. So you also could lose case capacity in that smaller caliber case, which could kind of multiply or amplify the difference. And then the big thing, of course, is powder. I'm going to say this term a lot in this video, all things being equal. But one thing that cannot be equal is powder. So when I'm comparing these cartridges, I'm talking about the same case, okay? And I get there's the slightest differences in cases. Like a 270 to 30-06, they're not exactly the same, but for all intents and purposes, they are. So same case, same amount of powder capacity, seating the bullet out far enough where you're not impacting the case capacity. And then of course it has to be the same bullet It's not going to be two different bullets. It's going to be like an AccuBond long range in both, or a partition in both. It has to be the same bullet and bullet profile. And then of course, we're not talking like a 7 mag versus a 308. Yes, a 7 mag or a 7 PRC is a smaller caliber than a 308, but it has a much bigger case with much more powder. Of course it's different. So that's not what we're talking about. Same, type and model of gun, same barrel length. Literally everything is the same except for the caliber and the powder. And the powder is the X factor here. So if you take a 260 Remington and a 308, and all things being equal, like I just explained, you're trying to compare different caliber bullets that are the same weight. The thing you have to think about also is powder. Because if you just pick the same powder and you put the same amount of powder in both, they're not going to react the same. The thing about pressure and the thing about different cartridges and calibers is they react different based on how much volume is there. And so a 30 caliber versus a 6.5 caliber, for instance, even if they're both 22 inches long, the volume inside the barrel is totally different. And so the more overbore the cartridge is, the slower the powder that you're going to need. So you can't just use the same powder in the same amount of powder and get the same results. So really there's going to be two differences. There's going to be type of powder used and bullet caliber, and everything else being the same. Now how do you get around the difference in powder? Well, you just try to get the optimum powder. And so in a reloading manual, you'll see various powders used and try to go with like the best, the one that's going the fastest. And that's going to be a different powder in, say, a 30 caliber versus a 270 caliber. It's not going to be the same powder. There might be the same powder used for both. They're going to be different amounts, and they're not going to perform the same because of volume and pressure, like I said. So basically, you just pick the best powder that's going the fastest in both. And that's the best you can do, really, to even that out, that variable. And then you've cut it down to only caliber. But once again, it's more confusing if you look at a reloading manual. Sometimes you can tell that the person who did the testing for the reloading manual put in a lot of time and effort into testing a lot of powders. And in that situation, I feel more confident that they've found the best powder and that top velocity probably is the top velocity. Other times you'll open a page to a specific cartridge and there's like 3 or 4 powders tested. And you could tell that they just phoned that in. They really didn't care about that cartridge, but they wanted to include it in their reloading manual. So somebody on one day went out with 3 different powders and did a little bit of testing just so they could put that information in the book. And it's not that that's invalid information, it's valid, but you could tell they didn't really try. And so that's something else you got to be aware of with the reloading manual. Did they really try out a lot of powders? I've seen certain calibers that they've really tested and found amazing loads with. And other calibers, which by all accounts has more case capacity, different other factors that would cause you to think it should go faster, but yet it doesn't. And then you realize, well, they only use like 3 powders. So I've seen reloading manuals have information that is not where it should be, that you could get that cartridge much faster. And then, for instance, the Hornady manual, the 6.5 Creedmoor, you can tell they've used a lot of different powders, and they've got that thing really going fast on some of those powders. But you can do that with any cartridge. You just have to put in the time, test a lot of different powders, and find the one that really is that optimum performance. So it's not always straightforward when you're looking at a reloading manual. But hopefully the point here is I'm getting you to try to understand is that all things are equal, even powder being optimum in both. You found the best powder that's going to give you the best performance. And then all that you're left with is the different calibers. And like I've hopefully got you to understand, because of the geometry of the bullet and just the physics involved, there is an advantage to a bigger caliber. Now, before you comment, I understand there's always kind of an opposite and equal force, and there's always a different way to look at this. So the shorter, fatter bullet does have the advantage that I've talked about. But of course, a longer, sleeker bullet has an advantage in ballistic coefficiency and air drag. It's going to have reduced air drag, better ballistic coefficient, and it's simply going to retain its energy and velocity downrange better. So if you are an F-class shooter shooting 1,000 yards, this bigger caliber advantage means nothing, because you are not looking for that type of bullet. You're looking for a heavier high BC bullet that's going to, beat the wind better at 1,000 yards. It's going to resist wind drift better, and it's just simply going to have a flatter trajectory at 1,000 yards. So for a long-range target shooter, in all honesty, you'd have a bigger advantage going with the opposite, a smaller caliber cartridge. And if you're lacking speed, well, you just get a 30-inch barrel or a 34-inch barrel. That's how they get speed. They like speed, but they're more concerned with consistency and accuracy, and then they can get that speed by the longer barrel. And so for a long-range target shooter, the bigger caliber advantage is not an advantage. But I'm talking about hunting. Let's talk about practical hunting distances. This is going to be controversial, and if you disagree with me, that's okay. We're just going to have to agree to disagree. But I think really a 1/4 mile and in, so that's 440 yards and in, is a practical hunting distance. I don't think 500 or 600 yards is out of the realm of possibility in certain circumstances. And if you've practiced and you're extremely good and a lot of other things line up perfectly, I don't think, from 440 to 600 is out of the realm of possibility, but it's on the extreme. And in my opinion, beyond 600 yards, come on, you need to get closer. Just my opinion. But let's just use the distance of 400 yards and in as practical hunting distances. I understand out west, your average, typical shot will be longer than the average shot in the Midwest or the East, just based on the terrain, of course. But I think everyone's going to agree most of your shots are within probably 300 yards. Some places within 100 yards. So the odds of you having a 500 to 600 yard shot at game are less likely, and really should only be taken in extreme situations where you feel extremely confident. And so within practical hunting distances, that higher BC really doesn't do a whole lot. I've had people comment that BC is a made-up number and it doesn't mean anything and it's not real. Yes, it's real. Yes, it does something. And if all things being equal, you could have the same velocity and have better BC, why wouldn't you want that? That's why I typically do like higher BC bullets. That's why I kind of like the terminal ascent better than the trophy bonded tip. Very similar bullets, I just like the high BC version. BC is a real thing, and if I can get extra help with air drag, awesome, I definitely want it. But if you get a ballistics calculator out and you really plot this out, and you compare, a faster bullet that's in a bigger caliber, let's say 200 feet per second faster out of the muzzle, and then you compare it to the other one that's obviously coming out of the muzzle slower but has a much better BC. At 400 yards, one's kind of caught up with the other. From 0 to 200 yards, you have a clear advantage in the bigger caliber, right? It started out faster and therefore had more energy. And within 200 yards, it still has an advantage. You're getting closer to 300 yards, you're definitely going to see things starting to tighten up a little bit. And you get to 400 yards, for all intents and purposes, they're going to be about the same, okay? So 400 yards, you're not going to have any advantage, really. And it's different. Like, this comparison would apply to one, and a different comparison would be a little different. But let's just throw it out there that the bigger caliber advantage is gone at 400 yards. That's a real possibility. Now, from 400 to 1,000, you're going to see a shift. The higher BC bullet is going to start taking over and actually have more velocity and more energy and cut the wind a little bit better, right? But once again, in practical hunting distances, 0 to 400 yards, you either have an advantage with the wider diameter bullet, the bigger caliber, or it's the same, okay? And so for practical hunting distances, it's a clear advantage. Now, let's look at some other aspects of this. I said at the beginning, when I was saying all things being equal, I mentioned that sitting the bullets out far enough where case capacity is not an issue. But now that we've explained the bigger caliber advantage, you could throw that on top and say you don't have to do that, but yet you do have a secondary advantage in the bigger caliber in the fact you don't have to push it as far in. And so not only just based on the physics and the geometry of the bullet do you have an advantage, but additionally, you can have your bullet seated out further without risk of case capacity. And so that's another potential advantage. Now, that only means anything if the powder that you're using, has like 100% case fill or is a compressed load. So there's times that's not going to matter, but it definitely can matter. And then there's a third thing, and it's that volume. So we talked about how a 22-inch 30 caliber bullet has a lot more volume than, say, a 6.5 caliber 22-inch barrel. It's the same length, but a lot more volume. That's why the smaller and smaller that you get in caliber with the same case and powder behind it, the more overbore it is, because it simply has the same amount of powder, the same amount of energy and force being funneled through a smaller hole, and that increases pressure. That's why that you're just going to need different powders, right? But how does this affect you? Well, when a cartridge is less overbore, it has a longer barrel life. And so a 308 versus a 243, for instance, the 308 is going to have a much longer barrel life. It's not that a 243 is terrible, but I'm just going to throw it out there, probably 5 times better barrel life on a 308 versus a 243. A lot of factors would depend on that, and it could be a little different. It's not an exact science, but I'm just going to say 5 times better barrel life on a 308. Now, I've been using the example of a 308 case, and with that amount of powder, 22-inch barrel's probably good, whether you're talking about a 243 or a 308, or even up to a 338 Federal, 358 Winchester. It's probably fine. But let's move up to 30-06 case. Say we're talking about a 30-06 versus a 25-06. Because the case is bigger and there's more powder to be burned, in my opinion, you really kind of have a disadvantage with a 22-inch barrel out of a 25-06. Can it do it? Absolutely. Is it going to be bad? No, it's going to be fine. But in my opinion, when you have that much smaller of a caliber and you're that much overbore, you really need to extend the barrel length, probably like to 24 inches. And then if you're talking about something like, a 257 Weatherby, it's that smaller diameter, plus it's got even more powder. You probably need a 26-inch barrel. I'm not saying you have to have that. I'm just saying to get the optimum performance. And so the more overbore you get, the less volume, and therefore you probably need a longer barrel. So a 30-06 can get away with a 22-inch barrel better than say a 270 or a 25-06. It's just more geared to that shorter barrel. So whether you're talking about 308 or a 30-06 compared to like a 243 or a 25-06, you just have a lot of advantages. The bigger caliber advantage, like I talked about, because of the surface area on the back of the bullet and the sides. On top of that, not having to seat your bullet in can give you more, latitude and options on seating depth. Having more volume in the same length barrel can make your barrel life longer, can potentially give you the performance you want with a shorter barrel that's lighter in weight. Once again, easier to carry, better for hunting. So it's just undeniable there's an advantage there for hunters shooting within practical hunting distances. Now you might say, well, you're using 30 caliber versus smaller calibers. What about, say, a 35 Whelen versus a 30-06? Or a 358 Winchester versus a 308? Same thing applies. The same weight bullet would go much faster out of a 35 Whelen than it would a 30-06, or a 358 Winchester versus a 308 Winchester. Which leads me to the second part of this, and it comes down to recoil. I'm comparing the same bullet weight in different calibers. There's another way to compare cartridges and bullets, and that would be by the same BC. So if you take the sectional density or the ballistic coefficient of a bullet and you compare that, and this might not be exact, but say like a 140 grain bullet in a 6.5 caliber versus like a 160, 170 grain bullet in a 7mm, maybe a 200 grain bullet in a 30 caliber. Those are all going to have similar ballistic coefficients, similar sectional density, but obviously they get heavier and heavier as the bigger calibers. And so this is a totally different way to look at it, and it's a really good way to compare things. So when the BC is the same, all things being equal, in theory, that would also mean the velocity would be around the same. Now, a lot of things depend and a lot of things to factor in, but let's just say velocity is the same, BC is the same, but one bullet in the bigger caliber is much heavier, right? And so it's just a factor. The smaller caliber in this instance has less recoil, and the bigger caliber in this instance has more energy. So a 200 grain bullet in a 308 is going to have a lot more energy, and then a, say, 140 grain bullet in a 260 Remington, okay, is going to have much less recoil, but you're getting the same BC. With sectional density, your penetration will be the same probably. You'll have similar drop, you'll have similar wind resistance. The bigger caliber has it's going to make a bigger hole, which is another advantage I haven't talked about. It's going to have a bigger hole and a lot more energy, okay? It's going to smack that animal with much more force. But in return, it's going to smack you with a lot more force. And so it's simply a matter of, what do you prefer? More energy, or do you prefer less recoil? Which really is why the 30 caliber, and I would say the 7mm as well, is really just a good caliber overall, because you have the bigger caliber advantage compared to smaller calibers like I talked about. But if the BC is the same, for instance, you don't have quite the recoil as you would in a much bigger caliber. So the same BC bullet in a 35 Whelen versus a 30-06, same BC bullet, you're going to have much more recoil in the 35 Whelen. And so it just seems like that 30 caliber, and then to a degree the 7mm, that's why they're so popular. Just such a good balance. And so to summarize these comparisons, if the bullet weighs the same in different calibers, all things being equal, the bigger caliber will be much faster. And in the same comparison, but having two bullets with the same BC, the bigger caliber will have a lot more energy. Once again, long-range target shooting, you don't need a bigger caliber. You're just fine with the smaller caliber, and the advantages a bigger caliber bullet will give you is not really going to be of any use to you. But if you're a hunter within practical hunting distances, the odds are stacked in favor of the bigger caliber bullet. Now let's say a quick thing about wind drift and bucking the wind. Of course, the high BC bullet will buck the wind a little better. But if you really plot it out on a ballistics calculator, you're really not going to see much, an inch or two difference at around 400 yards. That advantage of the high BC bullet really doesn't do that much against wind until you get beyond 400 yards. And so yeah, from 400 and the closer you get to 1,000, the much bigger the gap is, the much better the high BC bullet acts against wind. But within 400 yards, it really doesn't have much of an impact at all. All right, so let's just get down to very practical terms. Let's say you got a 308 and you want to get into reloading. I can tell you a load I've created is 130 grain Barnes TTSX going 3,300 feet per second with tack powder. That's out of a 22-inch barrel. Now that's a great example of a low BC, low sectional density bullet that, because of what it is, gets tremendous velocity, has that bigger caliber advantage. You know, I've got plenty of room in the case, don't have to worry about sitting the bullet deep. It's a 30 caliber bore, therefore plenty of volume. Therefore 22 inches is just fine. I don't need more than that. I could probably get away with less. Long barrel life, low recoil. Even the lack of sectional density is counteracted with the bullet construction. That monolithic bullet's going to penetrate really well. And so to me, it's just a win-win-win. But that's an example of a bullet that is performing tremendously, yet it doesn't have high BC, doesn't have sectional density. Once again, within practical hunting distances. Let me compare that to my 270 short mag. Now, I've been preaching this whole video, all things being equal. This is not equal, okay? It's a much bigger case. But just to give you an example, with a 130 grain bullet, I've actually only got like 3250 on the feet per second. That's with IMR 4350. I know I could do better than that. I think the 270 short mag with a 130 grain bullet is easily capable, not easily, but it's capable of, I'd say, 3,400 feet per second. So I think my 3,300 feet per second 308 load is pretty well maxed out. I just can't see you getting better than that. I think I've reached the peak with a 22-inch 308. I'm not saying somebody hasn't done better, but I'm saying that's just about as good as you're going to get. And I couldn't get beyond 3250 in my 270 short mag. However, I feel like if I put more time into it, found the right powder, I could get probably 3,400 feet per second peak. So just think about that. If I do put more time into it and get 3,400 feet per second at a 270 short mag, that's a much bigger case with much more powder, and it's only 100 feet per second more than that little 308 shooting the same weight bullet. Pretty interesting, right? That's a good example. 308 versus 270 short mag with 130 grain bullet, yet that close, you know, 150 feet per second difference. And a big part of that is the bigger caliber advantage. So just something to think about, just something I think is very interesting. Depending on what your applications are, it might not be that big of a deal to you, you know, especially if you're not hunting. But it's definitely interesting. Love to know your comments. What do you think about it? Do you agree, disagree? Is there aspects of it that I didn't touch on or something I forgot to mention? Please leave a comment below. Like this video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. More videos like this coming out. I've enjoyed drinking coffee and talking about cartridges and bullets and things like that. And until next time, guys, have a great day and take care.